The day I decided to move out of Sunset Ridge, I never imagined it would end with 5 police cars surrounding my house and my own son having to arrest our HOA president. But that's exactly what happened when Karen Mitchell decided that nobody leaves her neighborhood without a fight. What she didn't know was that her final power play would backfire in the most spectacular way possible. My name is David Harrison, and this is the story of how one vindictive HOA president's obsession with control led to her complete downfall. It all started 3 months ago when my company offered me a promotion that required relocating to Denver. After 15 years in the same house, I was ready for a fresh start. My wife, Sarah, had passed away 2 years earlier from a sudden heart attack, and every corner of our home reminded me of the life we'd built together. The promotion was a chance to heal and move forward. The moment I planted that for sale sign in my front yard, I knew I was in for trouble. Karen Mitchell had been the HOA president of Sunset Ridge for 8 years, and in that time, she'd turned our once friendly neighborhood into her personal kingdom. At 55 years old, with her perfectly coiffed silver hair and expensive suits, Karen ruled with an iron fist wrapped in fake politeness. She had a reputation for making life miserable for anyone who dared to challenge her authority. Within an hour of putting up the sign, Karen was at my door with her clipboard and, that sickeningly sweet smile she wore whenever she was about to make someone's life hell. "David," she cooed, "surely you're not thinking of abandoning our wonderful community." I explained about the job opportunity, keeping my voice respectful despite the warning bells going off in my head. Her smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in her eyes. "Well," she said, examining her manicured nails, "moving can be so complicated with all our HOA regulations. I do hope you've reviewed Section 15 of our bylaws regarding property transfers and the mandatory 60-day community consultation period." I'd never heard of such a rule, and I'd been on the HOA board myself just 3 years earlier. But Karen had a talent for creating new rules whenever they suited her purposes. The truth was, Karen had despised me ever since I'd opposed her plan to ban children's playground equipment from front yards 2 years ago. She'd claimed it was an eyesore that lowered property values. I'd rallied enough neighbors to vote down her proposal, humiliating her in front of the entire community. Since then, I'd been on her hit list, though she'd been careful to hide her vendetta behind professional courtesy. What Karen didn't know was that my son Michael had visited the weekend before to help me start packing. As a detective with the Denver Police Department, he'd been thrilled about the possibility of having his dad closer to home. Karen had seen his patrol car in my driveway and, being the paranoid control freak she was, had taken photos and made notes. This information would become the foundation of her most dangerous scheme yet. The first sign of serious trouble came when the moving company I'd hired suddenly canceled my contract. Their manager sounded genuinely nervous on the phone. "Mr. Harrison, we've received legal threats from your HOA president. She claims we need special permits to operate in your neighborhood, and she's threatening to sue us for trespassing if we show up." I tried explaining that no such permits existed, but the damage was done. Karen had successfully scared them off. That same day, I received a formal violation notice citing 17 different infractions, each carrying a fine of $300. According to Karen's newly discovered rules, my trash cans were positioned incorrectly, my mailbox was the wrong shade of black, and my lawnmower had been visible from the street for more than 4 hours. The accusations were so ridiculous they would have been laughable if they weren't costing me over $5,000 in fabricated fines. But Karen was just getting started. Over the next 2 weeks, she launched a campaign of harassment that would have impressed a military strategist. She hired a private investigator to follow me and document my daily activities, claiming she needed evidence of more violations. She spread rumors throughout the neighborhood that I was trying to skip out on unpaid HOA dues, which was completely false. She even contacted my real estate agent and threatened legal action if they proceeded with any showings without HOA approval. The psychological pressure was intense. Every time I left my house, I felt eyes watching me. Karen's network of loyal supporters, mostly elderly residents who were afraid of her wrath, began avoiding me entirely. My next-door neighbor of 10 years suddenly stopped returning my waves. The friendly community I'd called home for over a decade had turned cold and hostile almost overnight. The breaking point came when Karen called an emergency HOA meeting to discuss my abandonment of community responsibilities. She'd managed to pack the meeting with her supporters while spreading false information about the meeting time to anyone who might oppose her. When I arrived at the community center, I found myself facing a hostile crowd of about 30 residents, all glaring at me like I'd committed some terrible crime. Karen stood at the podium like a prosecutor addressing a jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice dripping with fake concern. "We're here tonight because one of our neighbors has decided he's too good for Sunset Ridge. David Harrison thinks he can just abandon his responsibilities and leave the rest of us to deal with the consequences." She went on to list a series of completely fabricated accusations, claiming I owed thousands in unpaid assessments and had violated numerous community standards. When I tried to defend myself, Karen cut me off. "Mr. Harrison, you'll have your chance to speak during the public comment period. Right now, we're discussing the motion to prevent any resident from selling their property without full community approval." The room erupted in arguments as reasonable residents finally realized how far Karen had overreached. The legal authority she was claiming simply didn't exist, and several former board members stood up to say so. But Karen wasn't interested in legal technicalities. She called for an immediate vote on her motion, using parliamentary procedures to shut down debate. Through intimidation and procedural manipulation, she managed to get enough votes to pass her ridiculous resolution. According to the newly created rule, I was now prohibited from selling my house without written approval from the HOA board, which she controlled completely. That night, I called Michael to update him on the situation. As a law enforcement officer, he was furious about the obvious harassment and illegal restraint of trade. "Dad, what she's doing is criminal," he said. "False imprisonment, extortion, interference with commerce. I'm driving down this weekend, and we're going to put an end to this nonsense." I tried to talk him out of it, worried that Karen might escalate even further, but Michael had inherited his mother's stubborn streak. When Michael arrived that Friday evening in his personal car, I noticed Karen's curtains twitching across the street. She'd been monitoring my house constantly, and the arrival of a young man she didn't recognize triggered her paranoid suspicions. What she didn't see was Michael's badge and service weapon, carefully concealed as he always kept them when off duty, but she did see him carrying boxes and helping me pack, which sent her into a rage. Saturday morning brought a new level of insanity. Karen arrived at my door with two burly men I'd never seen before, claiming to be HOA enforcement officers. The whole concept was ridiculous since HOAs don't have police powers, but Karen had somehow convinced these guys to play along with her power fantasy. "Mr. Harrison," she announced loudly enough for the whole street to hear, "you're in violation of the community moving restriction passed by the board. These gentlemen are here to prevent any further packing activities." Michael stepped out onto the porch, and I saw Karen's eyes narrow as she tried to place where she'd seen him before. "Ma'am," he said politely, "I'm David's son. What exactly is the legal basis for preventing someone from packing their own belongings in their own home?" Karen's fake enforcement officers suddenly looked a lot less confident when faced with someone who clearly knew the law. "This is HOA business," Karen snapped. "You have no authority here. In fact, you're trespassing on community property." Michael's eyebrows went up at that. "Community property? This is my father's front porch, and last time I checked, HOAs don't have the authority to restrict constitutional rights like freedom of movement." The confrontation was getting heated, and I could see neighbors gathering to watch the drama unfold. That's when Karen made the phone call that would destroy her. Pulling out her cell phone, she dialed 911 with a theatrical flourish. "Yes, I need police immediately. I have an armed and dangerous intruder at 1247 Maple Street. He's threatening homeowners and refusing to leave private property. Please hurry. I think he has a weapon." Michael and I stared at each other in disbelief. She'd just called the police on a police officer, making false claims that could get someone killed. Within minutes, the peaceful Saturday morning exploded with sirens. 4 patrol cars came screaming down our quiet street, officers jumping out with weapons drawn. A voice boomed through a megaphone. "Armed suspect, come out with your hands visible. Do not make any sudden movements." Michael immediately raised his hands and stepped into clear view, his law enforcement training taking over. "Officers, I'm Detective Michael Harrison with Denver PD," he called out clearly. "I'm off duty visiting my father. My badge and service, weapon are in my back pocket. I'm going to very slowly reach for my identification." The lead officer kept his weapon trained on Michael, while backup units secured the perimeter. The situation was beyond dangerous, and I found myself holding my breath as my son's life hung in the balance. Karen stood across the street with her arms crossed, looking satisfied with the chaos she'd created. But her expression changed when the supervising sergeant arrived and recognized Michael's name. "Harrison, aren't you the detective who helped break up that drug ring last month?" The sergeant's weapon lowered as recognition dawned. "What the hell is going on here?" Michael maintained his professional composure, even though he'd just been held at gunpoint. "Sergeant, someone made a false report claiming I was an armed intruder. I'm here helping my father move, and apparently the HOA president doesn't approve." He gestured toward Karen, who was suddenly looking less confident in her power play. The sergeant's expression darkened as he surveyed the scene. Making false reports to emergency services was a serious crime, and Karen had just orchestrated a situation that could have ended in tragedy. "Ma'am, are you the one who called this in?" Karen's composure began to crack as she realized the tables were turning. "He was trespassing and threatening residents. I have every right to call for help when our community is under attack." "Under attack?" The sergeant's voice carried the incredulous tone of someone who'd seen too much stupidity in his career. "Ma'am, this man is a decorated police detective visiting his father. You just made a false emergency report that put everyone in danger, including my officers." Karen's face went pale as the full implications of her actions began to sink in. Michael, now properly identified and no longer treated as a threat, pulled out his phone and showed the sergeant some videos he'd been recording. "She's been harassing my father for months, trying to prevent him from selling his house. She's created fake rules, imposed illegal fines, and now she's filed false police reports. I've got documentation of everything." The sergeant's expression grew grimmer as he reviewed the evidence. That's when Karen completely lost her mind. Realizing that her reign of terror was about to end, she launched into a screaming tirade that would become legendary in our neighborhood. "This is my community. I've protected these property values for 8 years. You can't just let people abandon their responsibilities whenever they feel like it." Her voice rose to a shriek as spittle flew from her lips. But then she made the mistake that sealed her fate. In her fury, she lunged at Michael, trying to grab his phone. "You have no right to record me. This is private HOA business." As her hands reached for Michael's face, he calmly stepped aside, letting her momentum carry her past him. The attempted assault on a police officer, even one who was off duty, was witnessed by 5 officers and would add serious charges to her. Growing legal problems. "Karen Mitchell, you're under arrest," the sergeant announced, pulling out his handcuffs. "False reporting, harassment, and assault on a police officer." As the reality of her situation hit her, Karen's legs gave out and she collapsed onto my front lawn, sobbing hysterically. "This isn't fair. I was protecting the community. Nobody appreciates everything I've done." The 2 men she'd brought as fake enforcement officers melted away into the crowd, clearly wanting no part of whatever legal consequences were about to rain down. Neighbors who had been afraid to speak up for months suddenly found their voices, coming forward to tell the officers about years of abuse and intimidation. Mrs. Patterson from down the street tearfully described how Karen had fined her for her granddaughter's chalk drawings on the sidewalk. Mr. Chen revealed that Karen had threatened to have his business license revoked when he opposed one of her board votes. As Karen was loaded into the patrol car, her perfect silver hair disheveled and mascara running down her cheeks, she made one final threat. "This isn't over. I have connections. I'll sue all of you. You'll regret crossing me." But her words carried no weight now. Everyone could see her for what she really was, a petty tyrant whose imaginary kingdom had finally collapsed. The investigation that followed Karen's arrest uncovered a web of corruption that shocked even the most cynical residents. She had embezzled over $40,000 from HOA funds, using the money to pay for her expensive lifestyle, while claiming it went to community improvements. She had created dozens of fake violations to extort money from residents who opposed her. Most damning of all, she had been taking kickbacks from contractors who overcharged for maintenance work, splitting the profits with her boyfriend who owned a bogus landscaping company. The legal consequences came swiftly. Karen was charged with embezzlement, extortion, filing false police reports, and assault. Her expensive lawyer tried to argue that she was just an overzealous community volunteer, but the mountain of evidence against her was overwhelming. Security cameras had caught her vandalizing residents' property to create violations. Recorded. Phone calls revealed her threatening homeowners who challenged her authority. Bank records showed the systematic theft of community funds over 4 years. During the trial, neighbor after neighbor took the stand to describe Karen's reign of terror. The elderly widow she'd fined for hanging laundry outside. The young couple she'd harassed for having too many cars in their driveway. The family she'd tried to evict because their children played too loudly in their own backyard. By the time all the testimony was heard, even Karen's own lawyer looked disgusted with his client. The judge's sentence was harsh, but fair. Karen received 3 years in prison for the financial crimes, plus an additional year for the false police report and assault charges. She was ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA and all residents she had illegally fined. The woman who had terrorized an entire neighborhood would spend the next 4 years behind bars, and she would emerge bankrupt and disgraced. But the best part of Karen's downfall was what happened to the community afterward. With the tyrant finally removed, Sunset Ridge transformed overnight. The new HOA board, elected in an emergency vote, immediately repealed all of Karen's ridiculous rules and regulations. The mandatory consultation period for property sales was eliminated. The excessive fines were refunded. The neighborhood returned to being the friendly, welcoming community it had once been. As for me, I was finally able to sell my house and move to Denver as planned. The new owners were a young family with 2 small children who were thrilled to find such a peaceful neighborhood. On moving day, dozens of neighbors showed up to help load the truck, apologizing for their silence during Karen's campaign of harassment. "We were all afraid of her," Mrs. Patterson admitted, "but we should have stood up for you sooner." Michael and I drove away from Sunset Ridge with mixed emotions. I was sad to leave the home I'd shared with Sarah, but excited about the fresh start waiting in Denver. More than that, I was proud of how we'd handled the situation. We hadn't let Karen's bullying drive us away in defeat. Instead, we'd stood our ground and fought back with truth and justice. 6 months later, I received a letter forwarded from my old address. It was from Karen, writing from federal prison. She was still claiming to be the victim, insisting that she'd been unfairly persecuted for trying to maintain community standards. She blamed me for destroying everything she'd built and vowed to return someday to restore order to Sunset Ridge. I showed the letter to Michael, who just laughed and tossed it in the trash. "Some people never learn, Dad," he said, "but at least she can't hurt anyone else now." He was right. Karen's 4-year prison sentence would give the community time to heal and establish new leadership based on cooperation rather than intimidation. The woman who had tried to trap me in her neighborhood kingdom was now trapped herself, in a much smaller cell with much less comfortable accommodations. The last time I visited Sunset Ridge, the transformation was remarkable. Children played freely in their yards without fear of arbitrary fines. Neighbors chatted over fences and organized block parties. The community garden that Karen had tried to ban was thriving, tended by volunteers who took pride in their shared space. Most telling of all, the new HOA president was a soft-spoken retired teacher who believed in building consensus rather than ruling by fear. As I drove through the neighborhood where I'd once lived in terror of my own HOA, I couldn't help but smile. Karen Mitchell had thought she was untouchable, protected by her little kingdom of fear and intimidation. She'd believed that calling the cops on my son would be her ultimate power play, the move that would finally crush any resistance to her authority. Instead, it had been the beginning of her end. Sometimes justice comes in unexpected ways, and sometimes the very weapon someone uses against you becomes the instrument of their own destruction. Karen had called the police on a police officer, and that single act of arrogance had brought down her entire house of cards. Today, I'm happily settled in Denver, living just 20 minutes from Michael and his family. My new neighborhood has an HOA too, but it's run by reasonable people who understand that their job is to serve the community, not rule it. I've even joined the board myself, determined to make sure no future Karen Mitchell ever gets the chance to terrorize innocent homeowners. And somewhere in a federal prison, the former queen of Sunset Ridge is learning that real authority comes from respect and trust, not fear and intimidation. It's a lesson that came far too late for her, but hopefully not too late for the next power-hungry HOA president who thinks they're above the law. The moral of this story is simple. Bullies always fall eventually, and karma has a way of using their own weapons against them. Karen Mitchell called the cops on me for moving out of her neighborhood. She lost everything when my son showed his badge and arrested her instead. Justice isn't always swift, but when it finally arrives, it's often more satisfying than anyone could have imagined.